girls? I am so excited for week 4. We are going through Galatians 4, and this week the theme of chapter 4 is how God fully knows us and how we are sons and heirs through Christ and how he just longs for that relationship with us. So we're going to go ahead and get started with chapter 4. We're going to start at verse 1 and we'll read kind of through, let's say through verse 7. And we'll start at verse 1. We'll go through maybe verse 3 and then we'll go to verse 7. But verse 1 says, "Now I say that the heir, as long as he is a child, does not differ at all from a slave, though he is a master of all, but is under guardians and stewards until the time is appointed by the Father. Even so, when we were children, we were in bondage under the elements of the world. But when the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive adoptions as sons." Okay, so that's up to verse 5. Let's go ahead, and again, we're going to start pulling out things super quickly here. If you want, I like to write kind of the theme up at the top. You can see it. I'm just going to write, God fully knows you. God fully knows. You can say you. I'm going to just do you. Perfect. Then you know when you read that, that's exactly what that means. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So the first one being, we're going to kind of pull it out of verse 4. It's kind of where we're going to start. And it says, "But when the fullness of the time had come." So what we're talking about there is that Jesus came at exactly the right time for God's redemptive plan. So it was right at the perfect time. It wasn't before or after, but it was right when God had planned. So we're just going to go ahead and write, Jesus came to earth at exactly the right time for God's redemptive plan. And we're going to go ahead and pull that one out of the beginning of verse 4, where it says, "When the fullness of the time had come." And I'm going to box that off, make it super simple to find. I'm going to go ahead and highlight it. That is such a beautiful thing. And one of the things I love about how Paul mentions this is that everything that happens is under God's timing. We may think that he's too early or he's too late, and yet it's at the right time that he needs for his redemptive plan and his work in and through us. Okay, the next thing we're going to go ahead and pull out is "born of a woman." So it's going to say, if you keep going in verse 4, it says, "Born of a woman, born under the law." This is reference to the virgin birth, so I'm just going to write that. Reference to the virgin birth. If you want, you can also reference where the virgin birth is. That might help you as well, but we're just going to go ahead. I'm just going to reference the virgin birth. If you reference it, it might give you a little bit more of a context, but I don't have it written in mine. So go ahead, pull that one out. Okay, let's keep going. So now we're going down to verse 5, where it says, "To redeem those under the law." So we're going to circle that part. And we're going to write that Jesus came to abolish the law. His whole goal was not to just come and be part of the law. He fulfilled the law and he abolished it. So Jesus came to fulfill and abolish the law. So same thing as redeem. He came to abolish, so he's going to redeem those who are under the law. And then if we keep going down in verse 5, it says that we might receive adoption as sons, which is a super cool picture because anyone who is not a Jew essentially is adopted through Christ. So I kind of want to make just a little note of that because that's such a cool picture of how we are grafted into God's family. So what I'm going to write for that one is that we are grafted into God's family. And I'm just going to write it right underneath here. Just makes it a little simpler. We are grafted into God's family. In other verses too, Paul, I know, mentions this also in Ephesians, this idea that we are adopted into God's family, but he mentions it specifically in this one when he's talking about how we are heirs with Christ. And then it says in verse 6, we'll read verse 6 through 7, and it says, "And because you are sons, God has sent forth the Spirit of his Son into your hearts, crying out, Abba," which means Father, or mine just says Abba, Father. Verse 7, "Therefore you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, then an heir of God through Christ." Okay, let's pull that one out a little bit more. And I'm just going to kind of pull out this idea of Abba. So when he says Abba, Father, Abba is a very personal, and even Father is a very personal saying that you would only use to someone who would have represented your father, not someone just in that culture, but you would have been someone so specific. So what I'm going to write is I'm going to write Abba, and I'm going to write a little equal sign, and it equals daddy or father. And it's a very personal father. So it was someone they knew personally. It wasn't just this vague, hey, it's my dad. It was a, hey, we have a relationship. And because of that relationship, I'm able to call him Father. If you want, you can also look this up. I did a little research into the Greek. I just looked up Abba and looked this up. It's kind of where I got how it was very personal, and also in cultural context. That's where I pulled it from. But there's a lot of other places you could pull that from too. That's just a very brief summary of what that means. Okay, we're going to continue on to verses 8 through 11, which says, "But then, indeed, you did not know God. You served those by which nature are not God's," and it's a lowercase g, not a capital. "But now, after you have known God, or rather are known by God, how is it that you turn again to the weak and beggarly elements to which you have desired again to be in bondage? You observe days and months and seasons and years. I am afraid for you, lest I have labored for you in vain." Wow, that is a huge chunk of scripture. So let's start by pulling it out a little bit. The first part is that you did not know God. So this was obviously before they were a Christian. So I'm just going to say before accepting Christ. So we know that this is in their BC days. Kind of self-explanatory, but again, just gives you a little bit more. And then the next part I want to dig into is going to be the following verses here as well, where it says, "You served those by which were nature were not God's." So what I want to pull out is that there are many beliefs, but there's only one God. And that's what the point he's trying to make, is that they believed all these other things, but they were not gods with a capital G, but gods with a lower g. So I'm just going to write many beliefs, but only one true God. And just making that point that it's not about, that we believe in God is not the problem. It's who are we following? Who are we trusting in? That's who it is. We can know all these wonderful things about God, but if our faith is not placed in him and him fully, then none of those things matter and they're essentially useless. Okay, let's keep going to verse 9. And it says, "But now after you have known God, or rather you are known by God, how is it that you turn again to the weak and beggarly elements to which you desire to be in bondage?" Okay, let's unpack that just a little bit. There's quite a few things I want to mention in there. The first one is that you are known by God. This is kind of the theme verse which we kind of pulled out, is that God fully knows you. So therefore we know we're known by God, but you can only be known by God if you choose to accept him. Now he knows you before, but you can have that personal relationship like we talked about with Abba being our father, when you truly have this relationship with him. So what I'm going to write is that our relationship with God must be public and private. It's not just enough to have one with him, but we need to intimately know him. And if we can't intimately know him just in public, we have to intimately know him in private too. So I'm going to pull that you are rather known by God. Pull that little gem out. Then the other thing I still want to kind of pull out of this, and I'm going to pull it on the other side because it'll just be a little bit easier, is this idea that a personal relationship with God is a prioritized relationship with God. So a personal relationship with God is a prioritized relationship with God. Again, this whole idea that if we don't have this personal relationship with him in private, how can we then have it in public? And we have to make time for it. It's not something that just comes and happens easily, but something that we have to constantly be working at and pouring into. Okay, let's keep going. Where it says, in my Bible, I use the CSB, but in this one I'm using the New King James. In my Bible, where it says weak and beggarly elements, it says weak and worthless elements. So what I wrote, just because same thing, just a little bit different translation, is that they're falling into a works relationship with God. Therefore, they were focusing on the law. So they were falling back into a works relationship with God. And then I'm just going to put a little arrow, which means it leads to the law. So they were so focused on how their relationship with God was based on works, once again, that they were missing this whole point. So they're falling back into that worthless elements, which this one says weak and beggarly. Let's pull that one out. And you can even connect that to the later part. It says, to which you desire again to be in bondage. I'm just going to highlight that as well. You could also, if you want, highlight where it says you observe days and seasons and months and years, because that's, again, they're relying on that instead of relying on their relationship with the Lord. All right, we're going to keep going where it says, for I am afraid for you, lest I have labored for you in vain. So Paul is just keeps on talking to them, saying, how could you? He's poured all this hard work into them, and then yet they're so willing just to give it up. So what I'm going to go ahead and write, and I'm going to write it down here because it's be kind of long, is that the Galatians were worshiping and relying on traditions and dates and seasons, and they were enslaved to them. So I'm going to pull it from verse 10. I'm actually going to write it on this side. So the Galatians were observing and worshiping the days, months, seasons, and years, and they were enslaved to them. Now, all in all, it's not bad to observe seasons and days, but that wasn't the point. The point was that they were relying so heavily on them that they were not trusting in the Lord for what he was doing in their life and what he was showing them, and yet were relying on this. And this is what a lot of the church would have done. They would have relied on, it could have been days of Pentecost, there would have been all these other things that they were relying on for their salvation when that's not what they were supposed to be doing. So we're going to go ahead and pull that out of verse 10. One more thing that I want to pull up before we go on to verse 12 is this idea again of being known by God. And I'm just going to kind of write it up here because it kind of goes with our theme verse. that it's not just enough to know him and to be known by him. We want him to know us. So I'm going to write, it's not just enough. Pull that down. It's not just enough to know him. And we want to be known by him. Think of like your best friend. Now, your best friend's going to be someone who not only that you know intimately, but that intimately knows you. And think of God in that way, that God knows these details about you that you are also finding out about him. And there's never going to be a time in your life where you discover everything about God. And that's not how God intended it. The Christian life is something that we're always learning about and always finding more about God. But this is something where we're constantly striving just to know him and to know his will for our lives better and better. Okay, moving on to verse 12. I'm going to read to verse 16, and it says, Brethren, I urge you to become like me, for I became like you. You have not injured me at all. You know that because of my physical infirmity, I preached the gospel to you at first. And my trial, which was in the flesh, you did not despise or reject, but you received me as an angel of God, even as Christ Jesus. What then was the blessing you enjoyed? For I bear you witness that, if possible, you would have plucked out your own eyes and given them to me. Have I therefore become your enemy because I tell you the truth? Wow, this is a huge portion. Let's go ahead. We're going to dive into this part. And let's pull out the first thing is that he says, I want you to become like me. So what he's saying is that Paul desires that we should that we should imitate his consistency with Christ and his walk. So let's put that. So Paul desires that we should imitate his consistency with Christ and his walk with Jesus. We're going to pull that out of verse 4 where it says, I urge you to become like me, for I became like you. So you to become like me. Pull that out. It's so awesome that Paul not only lived by example, but he lived it when no one was watching. I think that's such a testimony to his faith that we need to live like people are watching us all the time, even though they're not. That our walk should be something that other people desire and are jealous of because of how strong our relationship with God is. Okay. Another thing I want to point out, and it kind of just goes along with this whole portion, is that it is better, we need to worship and to obey. So let me go ahead and do that. So I'm just going to do worship and then obey. I'm just going to stick it right in the middle. I'm just going to highlight it a color. It doesn't really have to match what you've got going on, but just another kind of key theme that worship and obey is important. So verses 13 through 16 is the first time we're kind of hearing of Paul's infirmity, and we know that he had some sort of physical illness, but nowhere that we're able to tell is it documented. There's little keys we have, such as at the end of chapter 6, we see that he uses what's called an amanuensis, so someone that would have written this for him, and we see that in other books. But this is the first time he's kind of letting us know it's something physical. We've also heard where he talks about he has a thorn in his flesh, same kind of concept. So what I want to write is that God uses Paul's weakness and illness to detour him to the Galatians. So it's kind of something that he talks about where he says, in my trial in the flesh, you did not despise or reject, you received me as an angel of God, even as Jesus Christ. So I'm just going to write on here that God used Paul's weakness and illness to have him detour to the Galatians. And then I have a couple of verses I'm going to write down for this one. Oh, I actually just have one. And it's based off of 2 Corinthians 12, 7 through 10. Again, you can look that up on your own time. I'm just going to leave that there for you guys to look up. And Paul also says, and I can't remember the verse off the top of my head, but he talks about how in his greatest weakness that God used it for his good. And so there's going to be things in our life that we may not understand why God has allowed us to have this certain thing or this certain illness. And yet Paul is saying that we should rejoice in that because God had a reason for this. And because of this, he was able to go to the Galatians. So we don't know if Paul maybe originally didn't have that in his plan, but obviously one commentator had figured out that Paul wasn't originally going there, but because of this, this is why he came. Okay, let's go ahead and continue on to verse 17, where it says, "They zealously court you, but for no good. Yes, they want to exclude you, that you may be zealous for them. But it is good for you to be zealous in good things always, not only when," and it's on my other page, let me go there, "not only when I am present with you." Okay, let's keep going. And we'll finish up this last portion. And I want to pull out verse 17. That's kind of one of the ones I want to pull out. And what I want to do is where they zealously court you, but not for good. Yes, they want to exclude you, that you may be zealous for them. Since it's such a long portion, I'm just going to go ahead and highlight that whole thing of verse 17. And I'll pull my note off to the side. And my note for this is that legalists come. So legalist comes cloaked. And I'm going to put love in parentheses because it's not true love, but it's not for good. So essentially what Paul's saying is it may look good on the outside, but they come cloaked in what appears to be love that's not love, and nor is it good for you. Starting at verse 19, it says, "My little children, for whom I labor in birth again until Christ is formed in you. I would like to be present with you now and to change my tone, for I have had doubts about you." Okay, we're going to stop there before we go into verse 21. And I just want to write, I'm going to write just one thing for this whole part, is going to be Christ formed in you. It's going to be one little thing, but it's going to be two separate ideas. So I'm going to pull one off to the side and put one right down below. So what I'm going to go ahead and write on the side is that Paul longs for them to have Christ truly formed within them. So he wants them to know that, hey, I have Christ in me and I want that in you, but not just this kind that's a surface, but something that where you have an intimate relationship that you get to call him Father, and God fully knows those things about you. So what I'm going to write on the other part is just a verse, and it's Romans 8:29. And it follows what a lot of people know as Romans 8:28, but this one is Romans 8:29. This next portion is going to take a little bit of a different shift, and it's going to focus on two specific covenants. And it's talking about the free woman and the woman in bondage, talking specifically about Abraham and his two wives. So let's go ahead. It's kind of a long passage, so I'm going to just go ahead and read through bits and pieces, and then we'll keep going. But let's start at verse 21, and I'll read to verse 24. "Tell me who you desire to be under the law. Do you not hear the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by a bondwoman and the other by a free woman. But he who was of the bondwoman was born according to the flesh, and he of the free woman through the promise. Which things are symbolic? For these are the two covenants, the one from Mount Sinai, which gives birth to bondage, which is Hagar. For this is Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and her corresponds to Jerusalem, which is now and is in bondage with her children." Verse 26. "But the Jerusalem above is free, which is the mother of us all." Okay, we're going to stop there and pull out a few things as we're learning about Sarai and Hagar and what this means in according to being in bondage and being free. So one thing is that Paul automatically already knows that these people are going to know exactly where this is taken from. So if you've never heard this story, look it up because it's going to give you a lot more context. But it comes out of Genesis 16. So I'm just going to write that right above two covenants. I'm going to write Genesis 16. I'm going to highlight that. I'm going to highlight the two covenants. That's what the title is in my Bible. That way I know this is where it's being taken from. Let's keep going. So we're going to do the first part where it says in verse 21, tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not hear the law? We're going to stop right there, and we're going to write, under God's grace, the focus is on who Jesus is and what he has done. So under God's grace, the focus is on who Jesus is and what he has done for us. This whole next part is going to be, it's kind of again Paul reminding us of that fact that here Abraham had two wives because he couldn't trust the promises of God, and he failed to see that God had his promise. It just wasn't in Abraham's timing. So this is kind of what he's pointing out, is that he would have known, yet he failed to abide by that and to truly trust that God had his best interest in mind when it came to things like that. Okay. I'm just going to go ahead and highlight that whole verse because that's the verse that is connected, verse 21, to what we just talked about. Okay. Let's keep going where it says a free woman, which is going to be in verse 22. So we're going to pull out free woman, and we're going to make a connection on the side. And the connection we're going to make is that the Christian life is marked by freedom. So the Christian life is marked by freedom. No longer do we have to be in bondage. When Christ came to the cross, he came and he set us free. Yet some of us can choose to live in bondage by not accepting him and by choosing that we would rather do our own thing. Thus, we are living in bondage to what our own fleshly will is instead of surrendering that to Christ. Then we're going to talk about the one born of the flesh. So it says in verse 23, but he who was of the bondwoman was born according to the flesh, and he of the free woman through the promise. So obviously we know the one that is born of the flesh is Hagar, and the one born of the promise is Sarai. So we're just going to make a little note on that, is that Abraham tried to, and I'm going to put in parentheses, help, or in quotes, help God by having a child with Hagar. Abraham thought he was doing what was right. He believed that God wasn't going to keep his promise, and so he just needed to have this child with Hagar, when in reality, that's not what God called him to do. And God specifically had Sarai going to be the one that was going to deliver him, but it just was not in Abraham's timing, which is why he kind of freaked out a little bit and decided, hey, I'm going to take matters into my own hands, and I'm going to do things the way I want, because I'm going to help God. But I don't know if you've noticed, in my life, I have noticed that anytime I try to help God, it never turns out well for me. God doesn't need my help. He is more than capable of doing it all on his own. But whenever I ask God for help and I want to help him, it's because I'm not fully trusting God to be who he says he is and to be God. Then we're going to pull out, and you can pull out of this one too, which I could have pulled, but I'll add it here later, is it's taken from Genesis 17 is where this part is taken from. We see him try to help God. Okay, now we're going to pull out the free woman through the promise. And we're going to write that Isaac is the result of God's promise through Abraham, or with Abraham. With Abraham. Do a little arrow, a result of faith and a miracle. we're going to pull that out of the free woman part. And this drastic relationship, you're seeing the one with the free woman and the one with the bondwoman is so different that God's offering you two drastic pictures. Look, you can either choose to do your own thing or you can choose to follow me and see the blessings that come out of it. And obviously it's super clear what these blessings are. If we choose to trust God, these are what he has promised us and is giving us in our life. One more thing I want to pull out is talking about Mount Sinai. And Mount Sinai is where Moses receives the law. Kind of just an interesting fact. It's mentioned twice in here, so I'm just going to pull out both. And it's interesting because that's where we're getting mention of the bondwoman. So again, this is where we're receiving the law of Moses. And this is something that God came later to fulfill. And we see that, not something that was ever intended to be this end-all, be-all law that we follow. When Jesus came, he completely wiped it out. So I'm just going to write Mount Sinai is where Moses received the law. Again, just a really interesting fact to note that that's where Moses received the law. You can make the connection here as well and see that it's mentioned both. If you want to do more digging, you could write where it's at and the location and the significance of Mount Sinai. I'm just kind of writing this very brief. When we're mentioning Jerusalem, it's in verse 25. It says, Jerusalem, which now is and is in bondage with her children, but the Jerusalem above is free. I'm going to pull both of those Jerusalems just as there's two mentions to Mount Sinai. And we're going to write it right below where it says, Jerusalem, being the new Jerusalem, is in heaven, and that's the one that's free. So Jerusalem, I'm going to do a little equal sign. The new Jerusalem is in heaven. Okay, then it says this part in verse 27. It says, for it is written, and this is where we're going to see that it's taken specific from a portion in Scripture. So it says, rejoice, O barren, you who do not bear, break forth and shout, you who are not in labor, for the desolate has many more children than she who has a husband. So this whole portion, if you want, I'm just going to kind of box it off here. You can do it in a color. I'm going to do mine in orange. I'm just going to highlight that whole portion. So that way I know where I'm going to pull it from. And I know it's being quoted. I'm going to highlight the beginning of 27 too. And I'm going to write on the side, I'm going to write Isaiah 54:1. That's where it's taken from. And then I'm going to write just a quick little thought on that as well. And I'm going to write that it's allegorical or symbolical. Obviously for this, and I'm sure there's other uses for it, this is what we're going to specifically write down, is that it's allegorical and symbolical. Then we're going to go ahead and continue on with the following verses, starting in verse 28, which says, we'll read all the way down to verse 31. Now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are children of a promise. But as he who is born according to the flesh then persecuted him who is according to the Spirit, even so it is now. Nevertheless, what does the Scripture say? Cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be an heir with the son of the free woman. So then, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but of the free. Okay, couple little things to point out. Going to be in verse 28, where it says, like as Isaac was, are children of the promise. That, and I'm going to write, as Christians, we are heirs of the promise. As Christians, we are heirs to the promise. only one other thing I really want to pull out is going to be off of verse 31, where it says, "So then, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but of the free woman." So where I want to pull out of that is that there's a vast difference between we live by the flesh and we live by the Spirit. Right here, there is a vast difference when we live by the Spirit versus the flesh. And this is, as we keep going into chapter 5, we're going to see a lot of this drastic difference, because Paul's going to talk about the difference between the works of the Spirit and the works of the flesh. But just another thing to point out is this how he's already kind of getting into it. He wants it to be known. He's kind of setting the stage again for chapter 5 and how he's going to talk about that. Okay, one last thing to pull out real quick, and you might have noticed anytime it says, "For it is written," or "as scriptures say," we know it's getting pulled from somewhere. So let's go ahead. We're going to figure out where this one is getting pulled. And this one is pulled from Genesis 21:10. So I'm just going to mark this on the side. Genesis 21:10, right where it says, "As the scriptures say." That's where I'm going to pull that one out. And that is all I have for this week. I hope you guys enjoyed Galatians 4. I cannot wait to study with you guys next week. We only have 2 more weeks, and then you guys are all done with this study. And I hope you are enjoying Galatians and that God is just teaching you so much through it.